Good morning from New York, and good afternoon to my colleagues in Italy, Perugia. And greetings to all, to all those who are joining us in this very interesting and important conversation. This is an academic collaboration between St. John's University College of Professional Studies and University of Perugia, and it's hosted by the Institute for International Communication. I want to say up front a very special thanks to Dr. Cecilia Kyrielezen for becoming my little collaborator here and making this possible. Today's program, or this conversation, is an attempt to develop interdisciplinary research in post-pandemic world as remote communication technologies keep facilitating global conversations. So we anticipate to focus today on the big questions of globalization, sustainability, and the future. So today's theme is going to be on the human cost of sustainability. And to do that, I'm going to introduce the idea just to frame our discussion. As I was doing research on this particular topic, I discovered that it's much deeper than I anticipated, and it's much more richer research than I anticipated. However, I'm limiting myself to just about 1,000 words, and also focusing myself on areas that I'm familiar with, and also where I was able to find reliable source of information in a much more organized way. So let me start with a quote from Goethe, Wolfgang Goethe, from his novel Wilhelm Meister, Journeyman's Year. And this quote, I'm taking this quote from another author, Ulrich Grober, from in his erudite study, A Conceptual History of Nachhaltigkeit, that is another word in German word, sustainable development, which you'll hear a little later. And the quote is this: baked bread is savory and satisfying for a single day, but flour cannot be sown and seed corn must not be ground. Well, human beings were always concerned if they would have enough for tomorrow. So this concern is part of the human condition. In other words, the urge to live. Historically, various parts of the world and diverse cultures have long tradition of integrating regeneration of the earth in their lifestyle. In the Indian subcontinent, I go there because I'm familiar with that part of the world and with the literature. In the Indian subcontinent, the Vedic tradition was ingrained in the thought process of early Indians. For example, among many verses, I'm taking a verse from Atharvaveda, from the hymn 12, which reads, O earth, pleasant be thy hills, snow-clad mountains and forests, O numerous colored, firm protected earth. On this earth I stand, undefeated, unslain, unhurt. Whatever I dig out from you, O earth, may that have quick regeneration again. Maybe not damage a vital habitat of heart. And this comes from the quote from forestry in ancient India. So living in relationship with the nature was the axiom that guided the ecological understanding of the ancient people. Regeneration was for the needs of tomorrow, was a driving spirit of people, of ancient people, popolo ancien, as the Italians would say, gli antichi. Monistic understanding of the ecology for ancient people, life revolved around forests and taking care of the forests. Planting trees and digging wells have traditionally been the two great acts of charity by which anyone could earn merit and universal appreciation. In India, at least what we call today India, sages lived in the forests, living simple and austere lives in search of spiritual perfection. Living with them beneath the trees were their students, who could learn the Vedic truths in perfect natural surroundings, reminded in 1,000 ways of all-pervading presence of God. Because they lived in the forest, the early Vedic teachers attached great importance to trees. Beneath a tree was the correct place for a disciple to receive spiritual instruction from a guru. The tree was a symbol of patience and tolerance. They carefully studied and recorded the herbal and medicinal properties of the forest. Some trees gained special significance, and poems and prayers were composed about them and the spirits dwelling with them. Just for an example, just see these greatly fortunate trees whose lives are completely dedicated to the welfare of others. How great they are that they bear the storms, rains, snow, and scorching sun, and then they protect us. This tradition of valuing trees was passed on into Indian culture and led to a subtle ecological relationship between human communities and the forest community of trees, plants, and animals. The basis of this relationship was the recognition of the rights of the trees, forest-dwelling animals, and plants to a life of their own, free from exploitation by humans. Human society depended on the forest for survival and prosperity, and therefore they had to protect it. Furthermore, the forest was a place of peace and harmony with God, where the spiritual goals of life could be pursued for the forest sages. Now, moving the geography a little bit, moving to the Middle Eastern part of the world, while the Indian subcontinent, the word regeneration was key. Now in the Middle Eastern part of the world, we look at replenishment, to replenish. And in the
Ma io, cioè tu, perché io l'ho levata sia il video che il coso.
By the immediate surroundings, how to replenish the trees that were used to build the houses was the concern of the community. We find in history that reforestation was common preoccupation, which eventually led to the concept of sustainability. In fact, it comes from the German Nachhaltigkeit. Simply means ability to sustain. Nachhaltig, sustain, and kite, ability to sustain. So currently, available, well-documented and systematic efforts for sustainability influenced by enlightened movement are found in the studies of forestry and in the works of John Evelyn, the British bureaucrat from the years of 1620 to 1706, and where he documented in this till today a book that good resource, Silva, or the Discourse of Forest Trees. And then later on by Hans von Karlowitz, a German bureaucrat, in the year 1713, in his book Silvicultura Economica, where he makes several practical proposals for resolving the resource crisis, including searching for surrogata, meaning substitutes, for timber, in other words, fossil fuels. Karlowitz systematically and intentionally develops the idea of sustainability, which eventually becomes part of our reality. Karlowitz may have been the first person to formulate the concept of sustainability, Nachhaltigkeit, but the practical understanding of the concept has existed since times immemorial and was a prerequisite for the survival in the long term. In 1765, Jean-Jacques Rousseau recommended sustainable form of forestry in his constitutional project for the island of Corsica. Rousseau's ideas of balanced consumption and reproduction was inspired by traditional methods of forestry he had seen in his native Swiss mountains. We know that wood was a particularly important product, as well as being the most important energy source. It was also the key raw material in this era. It was the construction material of choice for houses, ships, wagons, and other means of transportation, and was used to make everyday objects such as cutlery, tables, chairs, beds, and tools for trade and production. Wood was used to manufacture the spinning machine, an iconic symbol of the Industrial Revolution. In recent times, we understood that forests are the lungs of the earth. However, deforestation is now a strategic component of the globalized economy as a space for cash crops. Thus, the Club of Rome, in its prophetic report, The Limits to Growth, had blown the whistle in 1972. The 1987 Brundtland Report, just 200 years since the Industrial Revolution, in the grand scheme of the history of the earth, raised the cry of the earth of its sustainability. The earth in the last 200 years underwent fundamental upheaval along with the continuous economic growth, which of course was not linear, but accompanied by reoccurring crisis. The Brundtland Report raised the stakes of sustainability with all its complexities and gave us the sustainable development, the concept of we use sustainable development. In fact, this concept, sustainable development, is shaped by contradiction in terms, in other words, an oxymoron. And James Brown, in his very erudite article on the bioscience, critiques this notion of sustainable development, particularly critiques the Jeffrey Sachs advocacy on sustainable development, and points that it is really an oxymoron. What is sustainable and what is sustainability? There is no one single definition of sustainability. What is development? Also, there is no one single definition. Each conversation must define what the interlocutors understand by the term sustainability and by the term development in a given context. So the idea of this ability to sustain and the need to sustain have accompanied human journey, and it is as old as humanity. But it has manifested differently at different times given our relationship with ecology. Sustainability is not an invention of our times. Earlier, our ecology was circumscribed by surroundings where we lived, limited by our mobility. As time passed by, our mobility expanded, given our ever-evolving transportation technology. The sense of our surroundings expanded, and consequently, the exploitation of the ecology in the name of development, which today cries for sustainability. Using the Tom Butler's book, came out in 2015, is it overdevelopment? Is it overpopulation? Is it overshoot? Well, to conclude, we hope we developed an innate ability to live sustainable with nature. Thank you very much. Now I would like to invite my colleague Tiffany Moore. Tiffany?
Good morning. Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to our friends joining us from Italy. Thank you for being here today to discuss issues of sustainability and globalization and the vast and pervasive impact on our society today. And thank you to Dr. Montero for starting us off with, as always, prescient discussion of our topic today. I would like to address two issues, two observations I believe are hindering our ability to truly live sustainable. And it starts with our contemporary understanding and practice of sustainability, or the ability to sustain. The first issue I'd like to present to you, or rather ask you to consider, is the commoditization of sustainability. And what I mean by this is the pervasive and insidious corporate strategy that's used to sell us more products in the name of being green or sustainable. The notion that one can buy their way into being green by the grace simply of their purchasing power or ability is dangerous to our understanding and practice of sustainability. For example, a quick search of ways to be sustainable will yield a long list of products available for purchase in the name of being sustainable. This, as Dr. Montero pointed out, is an oxymoron, buying your way into being green or sustainable. I'd like to summarize a quick list of the search results that I found this morning on green products versus their run-of-the-mill traditional products and their corresponding price tags. Toilet paper, toilet tissue, $12 versus $34 US for a sustainable or green version. Toothpaste, $5.50 versus the corresponding $10. Rice, $1.40 versus an organic version of $4. T-shirts, $5 versus an eco-friendly $32. Socks, $1 versus $10. And finally, menstrual products, $12 versus $25. This model of buying our way into being sustainable is classist, exclusionary, and a danger to our society. And I say a danger because it fails to include Earth's most precious resource, and that's our people. When we exclude people from the equation in sustainability and instead focus on the products as a means of becoming sustainable, we exclude our most valuable resource, and that is us. How do we shift the focus from sustainable products to sustainable people? I hope to find out. The second issue I would like to pose to you today is, again, with our current understanding and practice of sustainability. And this is the emphasis on individual responsibility of being sustainable versus addressing systemic societal change. And what I mean by this is a concerted effort to pass along the responsibility and cost to the individual in order to avoid systemic change. I'd like you to picture the bamboo straws melting in your mouth at a restaurant, the reusable shopping bags that you purchased and now take to the grocery store, the recycling that you sort every week before placing it by your curb, the installation of solar panels, perhaps, the electric vehicle that you've purchased or someday hope to purchase, the ride share or the carpools that you've organized or perhaps been a part of. While all of these are undoubtedly an attempt to be sustainable and contribute to the preservation of our planet, they pale in comparison to what a systemic shift in change in thinking and policy making could achieve in sustaining our planet. Insidious campaigns by big oil and fossil fuel companies to gaslight society and to blame them for our current climate crisis simply because individuals choose to eat meat, use plastic straws, or fail to partake in some of the other individual behaviors I listed above, to distract us from true change and from true impact on our planet. This is dangerous and should be addressed. I encourage everyone to think of the following questions. How do we move away from buying sustainability? And how do we emphasize systemic over individual responsibility? Thank you for your time.
May I now invite Dr. Mark Cusack? Thanks, Dr. Moore.
Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me well? This is the important question.
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to do something, if you know me, that I don't usually do, which I'm actually going to read a prepared talk, which I think comes in at about 1,200 words. Now, I'm trying to figure out how to do it on two computers so I can look like I'm actually looking at the screen. Let's see if this kind of works. There we go. Okay. So I wrote about the challenge of the way that the concepts of sustainability and dignity go hand in hand, and the way that those two concepts together have largely been co-opted by scholars and by actually companies and by the global West. So I'm investigating that relationship, and I wrote a fairly long study. What I'm going to talk about now, my presentation, is the super short version of it. So here we go. So the big question I asked is, what if dignity is the price we have to pay for sustainability? And that's where I started. And I ended up in my research somewhere else entirely, which is, I guess, the hallmark of good research, because you don't find what you're looking for, you find something better. So anyway, this is what I found out. In the famous book, Development as Freedom, Amartya Sen writes, development consists of the removal of various types of unfreedoms that leave people with little choice and little opportunity for exercising their reasoned agency. Sen's argument is that development, and here we mean both economic and sustainable, must have as its goal an increase in political and personal freedoms that are directly linked to an increase in the exercise of reasoned agency. In response to a globalization driven by profit alone, Sen's framework makes sense, and it has been extensively co-opted and accepted as the primary foundation for an integrated approach to the broad issue of both human dignity and sustainable development. And there are many articles and research studies that attempt to directly posit that sustainability and dignity are integrated, contingent variables. In other words, sustainable development is a critical component of the persistence of human dignity, and human dignity, when protected, leads to sustainable development. This approach forestalls any apologists who are on either the environmental or political end of the spectrum. But the following argument: if sustainable development leads to more freedom and more dignity leads to more sustainable development, then there is nothing wrong with development, right? Seems like it's okay. The problem with this reflexive model is that it doesn't factor into account a second possibility, that model of sustainability and human dignity may be neither reflexive nor integrative. On the surface, this seems insane. For surely the opposite of sustainable development is unsustainable development, right? Or development that comes with the price of permanent non-replenishment and permanent destruction and permanent consumption of biological ecosystems. And that type of development must be inherently worse for the protection of human freedom and human dignity. Or is it? The problem is we actually don't know, right? For one simple reason: we've never had an opportunity to actually test that scenario in a true global free market condition. And the reason is simple. Globalization has never stipulated as a necessary condition for its own evolution the true freedom of peoples of the world. I argue that sustainability and human dignity are in fact goals that are diametrically opposed to each other unless certain macro structural aspects of human civilization today also change. And to do this, I'm going to talk about these two concepts briefly. What is dignity, and how has sustainable development been co-opted in current global discourses? Dignity is a morphologically fluid semiotic construct. I hate that sentence, but I kind of like it too. Its meaning has varied throughout the centuries, as has its usage. According to the United Nations Declaration of Universal Human Rights in 1948, it is proposed as a basis for rights. It refers to a kind of intrinsic self-worth that humans possess equally amongst each other and universally. But it's also not defined. While it is argued that is an inherent aspect of humanity, I would argue that it is only meaningful to define dignity when its absence is observed. It is only when it is lost that we can ask the question, upon what is its persistence dependent? And the answer is simple. The persistence of dignity is contingent upon the acknowledgement of complexity. When the expression of individual human freedom is aligned with community norms and cultural or historical practices, then dignity appears strong. It is unquestioned. Its exercise comes with social approval. But when its exercise is even marginally constrained, its fragility is revealed. The regime that we have in the current model of sustainable development presents us with a non-universal dignity within the globalization framework. We confer more dignity on some than others through the undisputed and uncontested global model of passports and nationalities. We talk about migration and illegal immigration, and we talk about the problem of migration, but we never talk about the problem that causes it, the problem of passports and gated communities in the world masquerading as nation states. Nowhere is this more evident than in the fact that the global system of passports and nationalities is not studied nearly as much as the problem of migration. Our collective silence in the global discourse is deafening, precisely because we speak of these things and have the symbolic capital to do so. We are beneficiaries of that system, and we do not question it. Secondly, we have to look at the way that sustainability discourses have become intertwined with dignity frameworks in the current model. Sustainable development, ultimately, I believe, has nothing to do with human freedom. In the current system, it is entirely premised on one thing and one thing only. And Tiffany, you spoke about this quite eloquently. Attempting to use technological development through research to allow for a continuous Western model of economic consumption and expansion without inadvertently causing damage to existing high population centers around the equator through rising sea levels or increased atmospheric activity. However, virtually every scholar who investigates discursive practices of both sustainability and dignity together always identifies them as reflexive traits of development. And there's a whole string of quotes from the scholars here that I won't repeat their names, right? Even more interestingly, dignity is almost always presented through an analysis of how sustainability helps the impoverished. For example, there was a study done on biogas production in refugee camps, which emphasized the link between biogas production and human dignity. Another study framed sustainability and dignity through the context of caste in India by looking at poor rural youth in Uttar Pradesh. Another study looked at dignity and its relationship to humanitarian aid among Syrian refugees. The pattern, repeated over and over and over, is a kind of, I hate to say it, at best, epistemological violence. At worst, it's a kind of poverty porn. Right? Sorry to use the phrase, but that's what it really is. Sustainability is consistently shown as being reflexive to dignity because the dignity of the poor increases through sustainability projects. But no one asks the ontological question, why are they poor in the first place? Why can't someone who sews clothing and sews them well decide of their own free will to go and do the same job in a different country and be paid the same wage for the same work? We know they can't. And that simple fact is the real problem. There is no true free movement of people in the world. And as a result, there is always poverty and exploitation. We just call it globalization. The kind of development that does lead to a persistence of dignity is a radical departure from the current methods of sustainable development. It can be best thought of as an increased tolerance for cultural evolution. We must, in short, allow the radicals and weirdos among us to thrive. We can only know where we will end up as a species if we permit our own evolution. But that is a challenge that is not politically palpable at the national level and is certainly not part of the global discourse. As but one example, embracing, this is also a radical example, embracing both veganism and, where the climate permits, social nudity would both lead to extreme reductions in waste. However, neither are parts of the standard political discourse. The reproduction of consistent forms of power and control through the mechanisms of cultural norms, i.e., nationalities, identities, nation states, borders, is the primary element holding back human social and cultural evolution, and therefore challenging back for a second and consider this debate from a Darwinian perspective, that correlation immediately becomes clear. The persistence of dignity is contingent upon the acknowledgement of complexity, which is a fancy way of saying the acceptance of personal evolution against social and cultural norms. In other words, sustainability is not about the planet or the temperature or the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Sustainability is really about our ability to adapt, to change and evolve into ultimately different humans. All things that we hold sacred within the current debate construct, the UN, the Sustainable Development Goals, the models of development, these are all things made up by humans. They are inventions of our mind, and therefore they can also be changed by changing our minds, literally one mind at a time, if only we allow it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mark. And now may I invite my colleague from University of Perugia, Dr. Valentina Sommer.
Yes, here I am. Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I can't hear you. Basilio, I can't hear you.
Yeah. Could you adjust your camera, please?
Oh, yes, I also have a PowerPoint, so maybe I can share my screen.
Yes.
Let me see if I can do it. Okay, can you see it?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to speak about Green China, environmental diplomacy and soft power, because China is already a key player in the important context of environmental diplomacy. If the People's Republic of China, which alone was responsible for 29% of world greenhouse gas emission, had not signed and then ratified the landmark 2016 Paris Agreement on climate change, no progress in this direction would be possible. Ecological civilization, Shentai Wenmin, which is promoted by Chinese President Xi Jinping, requires that the country's growth must not be at the expense of the environment, as happened in previous decades, and which strongly compromised the environmental situation of mainland China, especially in the coastal provinces and along the main rivers. So what's ecological civilization in the first place? Ecological civilization is an important concept proposed by former President Hu Jintao, associating it with the Confucian idea of harmony between man and nature, at the same time that Hu Jintao intended to build a harmonious society, Xie Wei. After having been a key element in Hu Jintao's vision of scientific development, Xi Jinping then embraced the concept with the aim of making the institution of the party and the state more green and sustainable. In fact, President Xi included ecological civilization among the main points of his thought on socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era, and it became a key component in the concept of the Chinese dream, Zhongguoman, which is a leitmotif in Xi's political discourse. The political slogan, clear waters and green mountains are as valuable as mountains of gold and silver, became very popular in the press after 2015. Already during Xi Jinping's first mandate, various organs were created Governance reforms were promoted and numerous documents were produced to give substance to the concept of ecological civilization. But the fight against pollution and defense of the environment are also matters of soft power, eventually, and the People's Republic will try to meet the environmental objectives set in its 5-year plans to strengthen its image abroad. In the wake of NICE study, the PRC has implemented a series of strategies that aim to strengthen China's soft power and improve its image in the eyes of international public opinion. Soft power has therefore been an object of increasing attention by the Chinese leadership since the early 2000s. In the environmental field, when important international events have been held in China, factories have been closed, the use of private vehicles limited, construction sites suspended, and cloud seeding technologies deployed in order to guarantee blue skies and so to present a cleaner China and an ecological China, Shentai Zhongguo, to the international audience. In January 2017, on the eve of Donald Trump's inauguration, Xi Jinping delivered a speech at the 47th World Economic Forum in Davos, focused on the positive sides of globalization and on the importance of the agreement signed in Paris on climate change. Xi's speech tended to present China not only as a champion of globalization, but also even as a new leader in international climate change politics, aware that this position to improve the image of the Chinese leadership at the global level. When former President Trump decided to withdraw from the agreement, China was confirmed as an even more responsible global player. The strong condemnation of Trump's decision by some European leaders was echoed in statements made in Berlin by Chinese Premier Li Keqiang, who said that fighting climate change is a global consensus and an international responsibility. Likewise, the photo of Xi Jinping planting trees together with children in the Chaoyang district of Beijing, printed in all the Chinese newspaper, symbolically contrasted with the video of the press conference in which Trump announced the US withdrawal from the Paris Accords. Moreover, Xi Jinping repeatedly confirmed his commitment to the Paris Agreement, thus helping to strengthen the image of China as a responsible great power. Aranger, the Australian philosopher known for his work in environmental philosophy, greeted ecological civilization as a manifesto for the future. And other scholars pointed out that the withdrawal of the US administration from the Paris Agreement can be interpreted as a window of opportunity for China to gain soft power through climate change policies. Well, if public diplomacy is perception, then the Chinese leadership is undoubtedly doing a very good job at painting China as a responsible global power, to the point that it currently seems to be winning the global battle for hearts and minds. In his book On the Rise of Xi Jinping, Carrie Brown argues that China has become the global champion of climate change, giving it a new, softer international image. Whereas Gideon Rachman emphasizes the opportunities the Trump administration gave China. In a report he delivered at the 19th National Congress, Xi Jinping put much emphasis on the importance of ecological conservation. Green development is therefore identified as a priority. As in China, there has been a clear shift away from the tendency to neglect ecological protection. And this trend is confirmed by a series of nationally determined contributions which permit China to significantly reduce CO2 emissions and reach peak emissions by 2030. Moreover, at the 75th session at the UN General Assembly in September 2020, Xi stated that China intends to achieve carbon neutrality by 2060, an ambitious goal and once again in stark contrast with Trump environmental policies. Recalling the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change and the Paris Agreement, in June 2021, at the Asia and Pacific High-Level Conference on Belt and Road Cooperation, China and 28 other countries jointly launched an initiative for Belt and Road Partnership on Green Development. The Green Partnership is aimed at supporting green and low carbon development and of power, and paying particular attention to the needs and requirements of developing countries, to which China has always been very attentive. And this is an extremely important point because, according to some authors, China's climate diplomacy looks set to continue to focus on building soft power and strengthening relations with other developing countries. Nevertheless, even if the BRI is presented as green and the win-win diplomacy initiative and green investment principle and policies are announced, some scholars are still concerned that materials exported to less developed countries and used for the development of Belt and Road projects do not fully comply with international environmental standards, as emission-intensive projects still coexist with renewable energy technologies along the New Silk Road. The fear is that China may prefer its internal environmental objectives to international ones, thus also responding to the problem of internal production overcapacity in some crucial industrial sectors, such as cement, steel, and coal. And why China might prefer to address its internal environmental goals to international ones.
The anthropology website
because as
Blue Cat.
because
I live in Whitestone, and there's online. There's these blue pants. I think they're called Maeve Colette.
Miranda, you're not on mute.
Okay, it's okay. I was asking the whole of you why China might prefer its internal environmental goals to international ones. In my opinion, because as China grows, its citizens' ecological needs also increase, requiring less polluted cities, cleaner skies and rivers, and the sound eco-environment in which to raise their children, making ecology, Shantai, a source of legitimacy for the party states in the eyes of the population. Pollution and the consequent damage to human health are among the main causes of social instability in China, and also brake on economic growth. And they can cause dangerous environmental mass incidents, whereas the maintenance of stability, Weiwan, remains one of the main objectives of the CCP. The connection between ecological needs and economic needs also emerged in keynote speech that President Xi Jinping delivered at the Leaders Summit of the 15th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity in October 2021. Xi pointed out that the sound ecology and the environment is not just a natural asset, but also an economic asset, and it affects the potential of economic and social development. For this purpose, he announced the establishment of a coming biodiversity fund investing 1.5 billion yuan in order to support biodiversity protection in developing countries, and also released the first white paper on biodiversity. And this was an important initiative aimed at building a green, low carbon and circular economic system and translating ecological strengths into development strengths. Since 2008, the Chinese State Council has been publishing annual climate change white papers, and in October 2021, it also published a white paper on responding to climate change, China's policies and action, which underlines the importance the PRC gives to tackling climate change and taking part in global climate governance, as green development is a necessary condition for sustainability. So building a beautiful China, Mei Zhongguo, is another of Xi Jinping's administration's mantra. Ecological progress, beautiful China, harmony between humanity, specific section of the volumes of Xi Jinping's speeches. However, there is still a significant gap between the strong position taken and the laws that have been passed and the effectiveness with which they are enforced in practice. The PRC still remains the biggest producer of greenhouse gas emissions and the largest consumer of natural resources in the world. And following the growing energy crisis, Chinese imports of coal and natural gas are even increased, to the point that some analysts have wondered if ecological civilization is not just an empty slogan. Actually, it will be difficult for Beijing to present itself as a global defender of the environment if it consistently fails to reduce the high rates of pollution still present in the People's Republic. As Leslie Hook pointed out, China is both the greenest in the world, but also the most polluting. Obviously, the decision China will make in the coming decades will determine the success or failure of international climate and environmental agreements. So in order to conclude how China is addressing the question that this symposium is asking, what if sustainability has a price? Undoubtedly, sustainability has a significant cost for China from an economic point of view, because many factories have been closed following inspections and supply chains have been disrupted with important economic consequences. So what if the price of sustainability is unsustainable for China? And above all, is sustainability really the goal that China intends to reach? Or is it not instead a means by which strengthen state power and consolidate its political agenda? Since the launch of the reform and opening up policies, China has experienced very rapid economic growth, which has been at the expense of the environment, coming at an acceptable environmental cost and befalling Chinese air, soil, water, and food. Sustainable development through ecological civilization is now on the agenda and a priority for Xi Jinping's administration, but to be achieved by the means of a top-down ecological transition model led by the CCP. So this Chinese authoritarian environmentalism can guarantee to accomplish environmental protection by sanctioning polluting companies and rewarding green behavior. But however, Chinese authoritarian environmentalism has worrying implications too, because its top-down, its top-level design and coercive approach raise the issue of increasingly stringent control over population, which has also manifested itself in big data monitoring, technological surveillance, and the establishment of political campaign, Yundong, aimed at verifying that citizens and companies are compliant with directives. In some cases, especially in the more peripheral regions, important green projects have involved mandatory ecological migration, Shentai Imin, of various communities with political as well as environmental objectives, such as settling nomads and sinicizing ethnic minorities. Relocations and forcible resettlements of ethnic communities in the name of the environment usually result in forced urbanization, with local people giving up their previous homes, ways of life, and cultural traditions and identities. So as Yifei Li and Judith Shapiro argue in their recent book, China's Goes Green, non-consultative coercive measures come at the cost of citizens' rights and livelihoods. And the risk of state-led Chinese environmentalism is in fact that of a centralization of power that is not ultimately aimed at environmental objectives, but at strengthening state control, while citing environmental protection as a kind of justification. The result is therefore stringent control over civil society and over the possibility of public participation in the decision-making process, which go hand in hand with the lack of transparency, consultation, and accountability that characterizes Chinese society, even in the new era of Xi Jinping. Of course, in the West, all these elements matter and do not play in favor of Chinese soft power, as they seem to contradict the aim repeatedly proposed by the Chinese leadership of achieving a harmonious society. So thank you for your attention, and I do apologize if I maybe took a few minutes more than I was supposed to.
Thank you, Valentina. That was fine. You did not take too much time. It was neat. So thank you so much. And now may I invite my colleague from University of Perugia, Luca Pieroni.
Basilio,
Yeah.
sorry for interrupting you, but I think you jumped to Lorenzo Medici.
Yeah, I
which
think
is
so too.
in the program before Valentina, but I think
Yeah.
that they can easily be switched.
Yes, you're right. You're right.
But it's definitely good to hear Lorenzo before Luca.
Yes, Lorenzo.
Yeah, thank you, Basilio. Thank you also to Cecilia for inviting me this
No, I'm sorry.
symposium.
Yeah.
And yeah, I would like to say something about the relation between sustainability and the international system. Yeah, sorry for my accent. It is a mix of British, American, Dutch, German. I don't know, probably some a chaotic accent, but I hope that you will be able to understand me. So here we go. According to some scholars, in the last decades, sustainability has replaced the Cold War as the dominant theme of global politics. The geopolitics of sustainability has become a new approach to governance, which acknowledges the ecological groundworks of war, terror, and corruption, and seeks to find solutions to these problems. Governments have started to develop green transitions, planning decarbonization, and aiming for more digital and circular economies. Today, sustainability transitions are happening in a phase of military insecurity. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, military conflict may be regarded as a still greater trend than climate change. However, the war has played a further pressure on decarbonization and minimizing dependence on fossil fuel and raw materials. Indeed, governments tend to see sustainability as a buffer against emerging geopolitical risks. In a world of climate anxiety and military competition, states are protecting themselves from hostile natural and geopolitical environments. In trade and energy, dependence on imported carbon, especially from Russia, is seen as a security liability. In particular, the EU is focusing more strongly on long-term resilience within its sustainability transition. That means greater capacity to absorb geopolitical shocks and remain on track towards a carbon-free economy. Nonetheless, if conflicts can boost a sustainability transition, the latter could be a factor of international conflicts. For instance, a green economy risks new conflicts. A global transition from fossil fuels to green technologies, such as solar panels, wind turbines, energy storage, and electric vehicles, will rely on key minerals. Demand for these, including lithium and cobalt, could surge by 500% by 2050, and many of the known reserves of these resources are in fragile countries that suffer corrupt governance and frequent violent conflicts. The rising demand for green economy minerals will drive new rivalries, conflict, and perhaps violence, particularly in South America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. Another factor of this possible conflict is green inflation. Green inflation threatens to derail climate change action. The world faces a growing paradox in the campaign to contain climate change. The harder it pushes the transition to a green economy, the more expensive the campaign becomes, and the less likely it is to achieve the aim of limiting the worst effects of global warming. New government direct spending is driving up demand for materials needed to build a cleaner economy. At the same time, tightening regulation is limiting supply by discouraging investment in mines, smelters, or any source that discharges carbon. The unintended result is green inflation. rising prices for metals and minerals that are essential to renewable technologies. Green inflation can fuel, added up with other factors, to a persistent high inflation that can destabilize world economy and generate international conflicts. Moreover, sustainability poses other international issues for the coming decades. For instance, in nationalization of sustainability. Instead of seeing sustainable development as a response to global challenges, governments may pursue sustainability based on their own national threat assessments. In this context, sustainability becomes a response to national priorities, not an exercise in seeking worldwide solutions to global systemic problems. The contrast between nationalization and internationalization of climate issues can intensify interstate tensions and can erode the significance of multilateral institutions in the green transitions. Sustainability has become a major trend in the last years, intensively discussed in the media, the corporate world, and the expert community. And it poses fundamental challenges for the governance of the international system. Different national and regional sustainability regimes may emerge. If global institutions decline and trade and supply chains are disrupted. Countries or blocs with strong technological and economic weight could act as climate security providers to selected client countries. Shadow models, as we have seen, of development in Africa and Central Asia to build geopolitical alliances is an example. The EU's green strategic autonomy is another. The nature of the interoperability and peaceful relation across national and regional systems will determine the further evolution of a multipolar global order based on sustainability. This is the end, my friend. Thank you. I don't listen.
You're muted, Basilio.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Lorenzo. And now may I invite Dr. Luca Pieroni?
Yes, Basilio, I need to be a presenter. Yeah,
Yes, you can.
Yeah, I can.
Yes, you can.
Okay. Where I can. Okay. You see?
Yes.
Yeah. Oh, thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for Cecilia. And I would like discuss just I don't know. Sorry. Just a moment. I have some problem about a presentation. You see the presentation, but it's a stop here. Okay, I don't know why. Okay. And the title is The Price of Sustainability and Unsustainability in the Actual Capitalist System. The question, the general question is the sustainability in actual capitalist system is not reached in the long term. Why? Because we can start from the recent Red Code for Humanity, and Antonio Guterres say that the change must act decisively now to keep 1.5 degree. For example, in the current age, we are just 1.2, and this one is rising and other indicators like warming, greenhouse gas, on some specific extreme weather and climate disaster are increasing. So the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report this point, this problem on for humanity. So this problem is the first part in this graph here is interconnected with the other global crises. Why? Because sure, shifting temperature is important. Is an important point for the policymaker, but is linked, for example, with species extinction or tropical forest laws, undermine in principle resilience of living biosphere. Or, but is not only linked with the between climate change and ecological point of view. We are also under global crises that are interconnected with change on climate. The first, for example, is the COVID-19 pandemic, and if temperature increase, also the possibilities to change from animal species increase, and also to transfers in humans. So this one is a banal interconnection, but we are also some geopolitical turbulence, like the war in Ukraine, when temperature on the warming increase, probably the land will be reduced, and when some shocks like the war in Ukraine determines problem in the wheat, and in particularly on insecurity, in the food insecurity on the world. So the question is large and not conclusive in this moment. So we consider from a theoretical point of view the idea of or the era of Anthropocene. Anthropocene denotes the current age view as a period in which a human activity has been dominant influence on climate, on environment. But the general questions is, and the researchers summarize in the saturation point more or less during the 90s of the last century. But the questions is that if you see some graph here, some graph here, we find that, for example, the increase of a temperature increase after 90. After 90, we have the big increase of temperature anomaly. Our carbon dioxide concentrations is the same. Tropical forest loss is after in the new century is the real big increase. So the question is, which are the causes for this result here? Okay, human activities in this era here are summarized in three big causes. Is increase on real GDP in the world. Also, in this case, we have a general correlation between real GDP, and other things, other outcomes on climate change. Why? Because during this year is just after 2000, we have a real increase on GDP. The same question is on population growth or another economic indicator like foreign direct investment. So the picture summarize the point is the causes of insustainability, and the results are presented here. But we have also some picture about the temperature change, the historical temperature change. And what we see, and in the yellow part, is just in the last 40 years, we have the problem about temperature. Before is around, until 19, more or less, we are around 0 increase, but after we have a positive trend, and it reached now 1.2 Celsius degree. Now we have another picture here that show in the next 30 years we can reach more or less 10 billion of population, and at the end of this century we arrive at 11 billion people. This one produce rapid urbanization, and these urbanizations produce negative consequences on water, high population, degradation, space waste. But the really important questions, and there are a great disparity in this way, in this way to understand the economic activities in the world. We can say that the population growth has a really different impact on high-income countries with respect to low-income countries. But this point produce also climate change, increase intensities of extreme weather events, and this one provoked migration. In particular, a forced migration is a movement of people that not depends on economic reasons, but only from climate change. In the last this one we have plenty of example of how climate change is leading to forced migration flows, for example, on Africa, Bangladesh, but is more important in the Americans, where mass migration, like El Salvador, Guatemala, will produce in the next years a lot of migration. So the conclusion is that in the forecast posited that there could be between 25 million to 1 billion environmental migrants by 2050. So if you think about is not correct this number here to 200 million, is it more or less 300 millions of economic migrants around the world in this moment. But if you think about these results, we can have in 30 years 3 times of the economic migrants now. We have more or less the scenarios, maybe 1 billion people move for environmental migrants, and these figures say that the total international migrants worldwide is an alarming prediction, and that should act as a further wake-up call for public opinion, a policy effort aimed at addressing the climate emergencies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luca. And Now may I invite Nancy, my colleague, Dito Nariello. Nancy, it's all yours.
Thank you, Basilio. You always pronounce it right. I don't know why you second guess yourself. I also have
Luca,
a presentation.
Luca, may I request to discontinue sharing your screen?
I don't know. Okay.
Okay.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Hello, everyone. Ciao a tutti in Italia. Posso parlare un po' di italiano, ma non troppo bene, mi dispiace. So I'm very lucky that I can give this presentation in English so that I don't completely embarrass myself and offend my entire heritage. So thank you for joining me. As you can see, my presentation is on the potential economic outcomes of virtualization and sustainability. So I took a little bit of a sort of virtual reality approach to this presentation. So some key terminology that I will be using for this presentation is as follows. The first is coming up with an actual definition for the term virtualization. So here you could see that when we say virtualization, we mean the act of actually creating a virtual rather than actual version of something, more at the abstract level. And we'll get into that more in a moment. The next is this idea of sustainability. What do we mean by this concept of sustainability, which in this case is the ability to for something to be maintained at a certain rate or level. Okay. Next comes this idea of herd mentality. So we've been seeing a lot more discussion of herd mentality in the media, as well as in journals that have been published from the time of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic forward. And we've been seeing a lot on this idea of herd mentality, which is basically this concept where people can be influenced by their peers to adopt certain behaviors. And we have heard about these behaviors in previous presentations today. Specifically, Tiffany Moore discussed this concept when she talked about this idea of panic buying, really, when she gave us the economic costs of things like toilet paper and how things have skyrocketed since the pandemic has hit. So when we look at panic buying, we're really looking at how consumers are buying unusually large amounts of products in anticipation of or after a disaster or perceived disaster. And I'm not sure about how things work in Italy, but I'm assuming that society in general tends to take this approach, and we've seen it during times of environmental chaos, when we know that there's going to be a hurricane, or when there's going to be bad weather, a blizzard, a really bad storm, and everybody runs to the supermarket, and it's like, for some reason, everybody thinks they're going to make French toast, because what goes out first besides the toilet paper? Milk, bread, and eggs, right? That seems to be the buying panic. You go to the grocery store and those shelves are completely naked. That's where everybody goes first, aside from cases of water too. So we always have toilet paper missing from grocery stores. We have cases of water missing from grocery stores, and then out with the milk, bread, and the eggs. So everybody gets French toast during times of crisis. But we've been seeing a lot of panic buying happening. And interestingly, everybody always wonders why the panic buying occurs. And according to the most recent research that has honed in on COVID-19 buying patterns, a lot of this is coming from this concept of survival psychology. Okay, so to understand this idea of survival psychology, it's basically the concept of where people are undergoing behavioral changes due to traumatic events. For example, whether it be a pandemic, a really bad storm that's about to approach, and all those other examples that we discussed earlier. The US has seen occurrences of panic buying, herd mentality, and discretionary spending during and post COVID-19. We've seen it before for decades. This is nothing new. I think that a lot of scholars are now honing in on it to see what is going to happen post COVID-19. Post, right? Because the numbers are always fluctuating. We don't really know where we stand with this pandemic. But for what we know at this point, we can say that we are out of the thick of it. But there's been a lot of discretionary buying as well. This idea of not spending, holding on to the money, right? Holding on to it, having that savings just in case. So one would ask, well, how does this translate to the topic at hand? Well, essentially, people feel they are maintaining control through this product acquisition. And that product could be the money that they're holding on to that they're not spending, or that could be all of the items that they are buying in bulk to protect themselves from this specific situation from occurring. So mass media has been shown to play an extremely important role in forming, remodeling, and leading the public opinion. You know, many people don't realize how big a situation is until they hear about it on the news, or until they see it in an article, or they hear somebody talking about what that individual saw on the news or heard in the article, or read in the article, I'm sorry. And then that perpetuates mass hysteria, right? So that's what we've been seeing being duplicated throughout the course of how the world has been running lately. So we have a virtual designer by the name of Jack Wilmot, who actually found himself living for a week in the world of virtual reality and discovered that it can be done. And you may think, what do you mean he lived for a world in virtual reality? Well, he actually wore his virtual reality headset for a full week to see if it's a way that he could digest the world around him. You figure he had time to do it, so he went ahead and did so, and found that it can be done. So when we see things like herd mentality, and we see things like perpetual decrease in products due to mass hysteria situations, we wonder, is there an escape? Right? And we've seen sustainability efforts take place. One of them we are actually experiencing right now, which is this idea of virtual conferencing. Virtual conferencing has been one output from this mass hysteria sort of situation that we've adapted to because of the COVID-19 situation, where we could not have traveled to share our work or our ideas. However, it's something that we still are maintaining because we know it's more cost effective and it's a lot more convenient to our lifestyles. Hence the reason why a lot of organizations and companies have done away with their brick and mortar buildings, and now they are just working virtually and out of their warehouse hubs. So what does this mean? Well, we are already purchasing online commodities regularly. For example, Bitcoin is showing us that we can do away with a lot of reality type spending and utilize that virtual reality world. We also find ourselves at times purchasing a lot of things in app. I mean, these days, one of the things that we cannot process virtually is food. However, we can get it to ourselves virtually, right? So we can order it. We can't just unfortunately push a button on our televisions yet and have the commercial just appear with the food in our living room. But some would argue, like philosopher David J. Chalmers argues, that that is actually on the way. So all of these concepts, when blurred together, bring and pose the following question, which is, in a world where we are facing product scarcity in times of crisis, and we find ourselves already purchasing online commodities, what is actually stopping society from taking on full virtualization as a form of sustainability and existence? This is the horror movie of questions for all of those studying virtualization and sustainability. Is this something that we can do? Will this break against our interpersonal relationships as we know them? Well, this is Jack Wilmot to give you an example that it can be done. Okay, think about it. Think about living for 7 days in a virtual reality world. Okay, the only time that he took it off was when he slept, mainly so he didn't break the headset, but he even made a plastic contraption and showered with it on. But think about it, taking travel to a whole new world with being able to experiencing it in your living room and not have to worry about using jet fuel to jump in an airplane and actually travel to a place. Will it rot our insides, or is it a sustainable type of option for the future for how we live our lives? So what philosopher David Chalmers presented was this idea of, can virtual reality actually be real? Or is it real-ish? Okay, how do we define and actually process what we define as what is considered real? Okay, well, interestingly, the steps that philosopher David Chalmers put forward, one of his steps for deciding if something is real is if it makes a difference. Interestingly, that concept can make a difference for the good, but it can also be considered making a difference for the bad. An example of that is how we know that COVID-19 was real due to the losses that we saw in mass quantities, right? So that means that that pandemic was in fact real, right? If it's not just in our minds, if it's something that we are actually experiencing, Chalmers would argue that it is in fact real. Next comes the idea of if it's not an illusion, a hallucination, or a fiction. This is the component where virtual reality really starts to chisel and pull at the fact of, could this be true or not, right? Because many would argue that virtual reality is in fact an illusion or a hallucination, and the air in fact being a fiction. However, if it is actually part of an existence of something occurring, it is not just in our minds. And it may potentially make a difference in where your mindset is. And 2 out of 3 is not bad. So that could file it under the fact of being considered actually real. So virtual reality is technically considered, because of those reasons, a consensual reality. You are actually consenting to experiencing this alternate world or way of processing and thinking. If something is authentic, right, it is considered real. And you may think, well, technically this broaches the subject of the real world that we live in, right? Some of our relationships are actually inauthentic, but that does not make them fake, right? So then comes the juxtaposition of what is authentic in virtual reality versus actual reality. So because there's just as much inauthenticity in our real lives as in our virtual world / lives. So taking these concepts and expanding on other concepts that we've seen throughout history, I just wanted to bring to your attention that this concept is actually not new. And the idea of virtual worlds and virtual processing have been explained for decades. And some examples of those are as follows. One major example that broached this idea of virtual reality versus actual reality was Plato's allegory of the cave. For some of you that are not familiar with this allegory, we'll just go through a brief synopsis. This is just a really good visualization of it. If you see all the way on the left-hand side, you'll see the prisoners sort of chained to a wooden post. And you see the world going on around them on the right-hand side, but all they're seeing are the shadows of figures on the wall. And how Plato describes that a group of these people that lived their lives chained to this wall, and all they did was face this blank wall. And it brings to the question this idea of the shadows representing fragments of reality that we normally perceive through our senses. But all that they were able to perceive them through was their sense of sight. And what they saw was not in fact reality technically, but was it? Because it was their reality. Right? So defining what actually is reality. And another example of us seeing this is a most recent example of a children's cartoon, which came from a Dr. Seuss book called Horton Hears a Who, where there's an entire world living on the end of that little flower there. So the meta-analysis of worlds, a world within a world within a world, right? And we also see that through the motion picture film, The Matrix, and all of those different levels of The Matrix, of living your life in virtual reality after being chained in a chair, and your mind gets to go live its own life in a different alternate universe. But another example of this from an authentic point of history, right, is in this Taoist work that we see here called The Butterfly Dream. This Taoist work basically is the visualization of a poem, and the poem basically discusses how this individual had a dream that he was a butterfly, and all that he knew was himself being a butterfly. And when he awoke, he asked himself, there must be some distinction. Was I a butterfly dreaming of being a man? or am I a man who dreamt of being a butterfly? So this idea of perception and reality sort of at its finest, and the dichotomy between the real world being our actual reality as we know it versus a potential virtual reality that exists, should we choose to take that on. So this basically brings us to the understanding that in a world where we are facing product scarcity in times of crisis, and we find ourselves already purchasing online commodities, the only thing stopping us from taking on full virtualization as a form of sustainability and existence is time. Because the truth is, we're not there yet, but we will be. Thank you. Here are my references. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me directly.
Oh, thank you so much, Nancy. And now may I invite my good friend and colleague at Perugia University, Cecilia Kirialeza.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. So please, first of all, let me thank Basilio Monteiro and all the colleagues from my university and from St. John's, because it's really a great pleasure to have been able to organize such a difficult event, mixing Italian and US colleagues, and it was very inspiring hearing you all. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge today. So I will try to focus on cooperation, okay? And let's think about making money, okay? So we all agree that sustainability is highly desirable for the whole of society, and not just for the present generation, but also for the future ones. In recent decades, the academic literature has increasingly explored the issue of sustainability by even anticipating the effective commitment of companies towards sustainability, which has only increased in recent years. However, thinking outside the rhetoric of sustainability, companies must consider and possibly measure the additional cost deriving from those activities and decisions aimed at not leaving the planet worse off than before. Bepiton and Gray wrote a great article on account of sustainability, focused on how to measure costs and advantages of sustainability. Some of these costs are significant and can have a huge impact on companies' profitability. So for today, I just focus on only 4 examples of these costs arising from a higher level of corporate sustainability. As a first insight, I wish to start from the end. The purpose of exploiting sustainability from a strategic point of view is to obtain advantages in terms of reputation and relationship with stakeholders. So corporations are not good. They're not concerned of the good of the society. They just want to gain visibility or reputation. It means that the efforts made in the field of sustainability need to be made adequately visible to stakeholders. But communication has a cost. In early 2022, the NGO Ceres, operating in sustainability advocacy, and the carbon software accounting firm Persephone commissioned to do a survey of US company on the costs they are currently incurring for climate-related disclosure. So the results were impressive, so much so that Forbes reported them. On average, corporations are now spending $533,000 annually on climate-related disclosure. So Luca spoke about climate and corporations are involved in communicating how much they try to solve this problem, but they spend a lot of money to communicate it. Just a few weeks later of this report, in March 2022, the Security and Exchange Commission announced a new proposed rule for the enhancement of the standardization of climate-related disclosure for investors. It means that these costs related to sustainability reporting will probably become a must for all listed companies. And the same trend is also underway in Europe. Second topic. In many cases, sustainability forces company to change their supply chain. Valentina and Lorenzo spoke about supply chain and the issues focusing on supply chain. Stakeholder pressure towards sustainability does not impact all companies equally. Companies operating in B2C are more exposed than those operating in B2B and are increasingly held accountable, not only for the sustainability of their operation, but also for the sustainability of their suppliers. In 2018, Gure and Saranga wrote an article titled Sustainability Supply Chain for Supply Chain Sustainability. That's really the matter we are facing now. As you probably know, the fast fashion industry leader, H&M, does not own any manufacturing facility. As a result, the company relies entirely on outsourcing to get its collection to market on time. H&M buys clothing from around 750 suppliers, with 60% of its production taking place in Asia. Yes, Valentina, mostly in China. Can you imagine what happened in 2020 when the company decided to adopt a more sustainable way to compete in the fast fashion industry? Among the pillars of this new strategy are the traceability and sustainability sourcing of raw material, as well as a set of ethical standards for suppliers that includes fair wages for workers, no use of child labor, and acceptable working conditions. Adopting a similar strategy led H&M to switch many of its previous suppliers who no longer complied with the new rules, incurring high costs in terms of contract termination, market research of new suppliers, and creation of new routines. Again, costs. Third topic. Sustainability implies a new vision of product life. Companies are now being widely asked to take responsibility for the consequences of manufacturing the products and the effect of its use by consumers. But the most recent trend is to make them responsible for what happens after the use of the product. It means that companies have to consider the costs related to the disposal or recycling of the product. For example, the cost of modifying the product design to improve its recyclability, or cost for the withdrawal of used products. The European Union, in a recent directive, has adopted the concept of the extended the responsibility of the producer, conceived by Thomas Lindquist in 1990. The directive states that the responsibility of the producer for a product is extended to the post-consumer stage of the life cycle of the product itself. It's not a moral responsibility, it's a natural responsibility. Therefore, in the European Union, extended producer responsibility is mandatory in the context of packaging of waste, for example. In practice, the responsibility for financing the collection, recycling, and responsible end-of-life disposal of the packaging is put on producer. The financial cost of this European Union strategy for corporation will be enormous. Will the consumer be available to pay higher prices to compensate for this higher cost? Tiffany cited several examples of costs for higher sustainability for products. Ideally, the measure of the extended responsibility of the producer should push industries toward a more sustainable packaging design, for example, avoiding plastic. In fact, many manufacturers are fleeing from plastic. plastic is now the evil. And now moving towards other more sustainable raw materials to make packaging, such as paper, for example. Barilla, the famous Italian pasta maker, I suppose you know it also in the US, has removed its iconic plastic window from the pasta packaging. And now pasta packaging for Barilla is just made by paper. By the way, are we sure that this is a completely sustainable trend? The UNEP has forecast a 40% increase in the consumption of wood and cellulose by 2030. And these resources are not easily renewable. Luca was speaking about this before in terms of deforestation, especially in an era of drought and fires, as demonstrated by the sad records of last summer for fire in California and in southern Italy. Finally, embracing sustainability can even lead companies to abandon a product or an entire business, incurring in immense costs that can even lead to the brink of bankruptcy. Let's think about what's happening in the industry of disposable plastic plates or in the bottled water industry. In 2016, Stackley, Enquist, and Sumbrickel published a book titled A Good Disruption, Redefining Growth in the 21st Century. In this book, they argue that to give birth to a new and more sustainable products and industries, the old ones have to die, and they are actually dying. Philip Morris has announced their intention to exit the business of traditional cigarettes, recognizing that tobacco is the largest cause of preventable deaths globally. In May 2021, the Philip Morris CEO, Jack Otzak, said he intends to lead the company's smoke-free transformation. He said the company's new mission is to find and provide less harmful alternative to cigarettes to the millions of people who would otherwise continue to smoke. According to this program, by 2025, more than half of the company's net revenues will come from smoke-free products, such as the IQOS. But what are the costs of this strategic step? How much will the company lose in profits? And how many workers will lose their job? Yes, Mark spoke about dignity, because the skill required to work in the production of cigarettes are very different from those required to work in the production of e-cigarettes. These workers will probably lose their job. In conclusion, we can ask, who bears all these costs of sustainability? Is the consumer really willing to pay more to have a more sustainable product? Is he really able to distinguish between sustainable and non-sustainable product to reward the former and punish the latter? Undoubtedly, sustainability is considered a new strategic imperative for corporations, but it has what Tura, Carden, and Patala call a dark side in terms of negative consequences. There is still a lot of research to be done to study this dark side, but remaining able to think outside the rhetoric of the myth of sustainability. So for the next conference, we can think about the dark side of sustainability. Thank you. Thank you very much for your attention.
Cecilia, thank you so very, very much. And first of all, I want to thank you in a very special way for collaborating with this original idea, crazy idea we had about over a year ago. And we talked, and finally, here we are. So thank you very much. Now, I'd like to, we have 15 more minutes to have a little conversation. And Nakib and all, I've seen you raising some questions in the chat box. Please feel free to speak, to raise these questions, and we are a good group of folks here, and feel free to ask any questions. You want to unmute?
Yes, I would like to ask Nancy. What about the power of mass media in persuading the consumer to make the right choices? Because corporations are pushed toward sustainability by consumer wanting to buy sustainable products. So what do you think, Nancy, about this power?
I think you bring up a really good point, Cecilia. And I think that the dilemma that we are faced when we have a question of the media and persuasion is which component of the media is doing the persuading. And the reason why I say that is because so many organizations are creating these wonderful PR advertising teams. And when we look at public relations teams, right, we're looking at those that are essentially managing impressions and are doing just that. So the question then becomes, who is fueling those media messages? Is it the unbiased journalists? Or is it those public relations and advertising teams that are working on impression management for their particular clients? Which really leads to a bigger discussion of the importance of media literacy, which I think a lot of schools lack. And I mean that at the higher ed as well as the high school and intermediate levels as well. A lot of people assume that because it's on TV or they're reading about it, it's automatically true. So I think that a lot of effort needs to be put in towards educating the public on media literacy to be able to decipher those messages with how and who is fueling persuasion.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure.
If I may raise a question, Mark, in his presentation, he talked about, kind of gave us a challenge that the existing system itself needs to be revamped. With the existing system, no matter what efforts we make in terms of sustainability, it may not reach. So the question now is to Cecilia, is to tweak existing system towards sustainability is a waste of time, is unproductive.
It's a tough question, Basil. It's not. I think it's not unproductive. I think that corporations need time because the consumers can change their minds very, very quickly, but the cost, they are not available to bear the costs. So Tiffany also spoke about this point. The consumer are not available at the moment to pay more for a sustainable product. Sustainable products are niche, but we are asking corporation to make sustainable products at the same price they did normal products. So I think we have investing in changing the mind of the consumers. They need to know that if you buy a garment that is too cheap, it can't be sustainable. You don't need to have more communication on that. It means it's not sustainable for itself. You have to be sure for that, but you have to be available to pay more.
Ted, you have a question? Raise your hand.
I have a question to Professor Musk as our ambassador from NASA. Do you think, as a practicing lawyer, I always look for signs to understand, maybe somebody understands something I don't understand. And I know NASA sent Artemis to the launch to the moon. Maybe they gave up on Earth. This is the conclusion, and sustainability is like, now it's only theoretically, and they know something better from us.
I think the question, Gad, I think the question you're asking is national investment in outer space a departure or a part of a global sustainability? Is that the question you're asking? Like the big picture question, right? The short answer I'll give you is I personally believe that we can frame all questions of sustainability through the question of energy consumption and energy acquisition. For example, if we have enough, let's say, clean energy, clean water is not a problem because you can always desalinate it, right? And if we look at the relationship between global GDP, global pollution, and global energy production, they always go in sync together, right? So right now, humanity is at about, I think, about 15 trillion watts per year. 15 terawatts is our average energy consumption. The US accounts for about 25% of that. We are 5% of the world's population. We consume 25% of the world's energy. And I think that, you know, if you look at it from that perspective, there is a very clear relationship between investment in very, very advanced R&D technologies in space and advances in clean energy. And I can tell you why. For example, in the 1930s, the Manhattan Project to build the atom bomb, that project was a wartime project. But if not for that project, there would never have been John von Neumann's Monte Carlo modeling and the entire world of what we have today as computational chemistry, computational biology, and computational physics. And that methodology has created huge advances in energy production, right? Same thing is true for the Apollo project in the 1960s, right? From 1961, when Kennedy announced it at Rice University, until 1973, the Apollo project consumed about 4% of US GDP. It was regarded by most as a horrific waste of money, but it directly led to Silicon Valley and the start of the US computer industry. There's a very clear correlation. And the advances in efficiency that result from a digital economy versus an analog one are tremendous, right? So I think that the question we're really asking is, you know, are we investing enough money in very, very advanced pushes for energy technology and for, I would say, honestly, space technology, because it's linked together. And I think that in this regard, our focus is in the wrong direction. If we look at, for example, capital markets in Israel, the EU, and the US, capital markets, specifically hedge funds, have begun allocating increasingly more money into small-scale fusion reactors. And that's on the corporate side, not on the government side. So the government is pushing for CERN, it's pushing for these very, very large-scale, multi-billion-dollar projects. Simply, they're not working very well. And what I really see is that, you know, you can't possibly have true advances in clean energy unless you have also advances in the private sector and advances, you know, in basically space technology and in energy technology. So that's a long-winded answer. I'm sorry, Gad, but I think that it's a very important issue to raise.
Thanks, Mark. Anyone would like to raise a question?
Yes, I have a question for Luca.
Yeah.
I was speaking, some of you know that I have a son which is 21. He is studying at university, studying engineering, and we were speaking about sustainability because I told him that I had to prepare a presentation on sustainability, and he said, "No, you're wasting your time because we have lost. We will all die in an unsustainable world. And it's very clear we are over the edge now, and there is no return. And all what you are doing, your generation is doing, corporations are doing is greenwashing, pretending you are trying to save the world." Or so Luca show a lot of data on how we are going about deforestation and how is it going about how this is impacting economy. What do you think, Luca? Is my son right, or are we still in time to go back? You're muted, Luca. You are muted, and now open your microphone, please.
Okay. Okay, but in principle, was only a picture about the general questions in the world, because the idea and the policymakers now is to found an agreement to obtain sustainability in the next at least 10, 12 years, because it's impossible to continue in the trend during the next 10 years in principle. So the last convention, COP27, maybe this the new era, because some advance on this point, and the policy party may be important in principle in the limits of temperatures, not only for the industrial society, Western society, but also in a development countries. So some different topic is now more inside the convention, the political convention, and probably the results is just we have a short limit to arrive to change our idea of economic capitalism. Okay, so and other things are just every spillovers over the idea of the world. But I'm sure that something will you do in the next years.
Nakib, you have a question?
Thank you very much, Dr. Monteiro, for organizing this excellent session. I must admit the whole series of lectures and coverage of the topics provoked a lot of thoughts. One, just a comment regarding the dignity aspect. When Professor Mark was mentioning, I couldn't help but remembered in completely different context. In the year around 2008, 2010, there was a wrong intelligence provided to the US Army in Helmand, southern Afghanistan. That Taliban were hiding in a residence, so the commander led an operation. They went, they blew up the house door, and later on concluded there was nobody. So the following day, the same platoon commander came in with a sheep, which is a traditional way of asking for forgiveness, and tried to feel better that, you know, this was a faulty intelligence. This story was covered by the New York Times. And when the interpreter had given over the sheep to the old man, the owner of the house, there was no body reaction, physical, showing the appreciation that, yeah, it's fine. And so the platoon commander was concerned that, you know, why is the man not happy? We came, we blew up his house door last night, but now we apologize. You know, we apologize, and this is the sheep. This is your traditional way of reconciliation. And the old man had asked the interpreter to ask the US commander, what is the price of my dignity? And that question has evolved and continues in my head. More specifically, questions to the sustainability discussion. From what I see, I work with the United Nations Population Fund, the United Nations Millennium Development Goals that were led in 2000 and succeeded by the Sustainable Development Goals. This was considered as a landmark achievement because global leaders agreed that there are 17 goals that we need to achieve for the well-being of humanity and climate change and everything. 17 goals, all of them agreed. However, there is no desire to finance the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. It is surprising that the Climate Change Conference, COP27, in Sharm el-Sheikh has not agreed on its outcome statement, leave alone the financing. My questions to the presenters here is, is it realistic to expect the global South to get financing assistance to achieve their sustainable development goals, specifically in the area of climate change, having that they've been left out from the technological revolutions until today? They're trying to catch up, and the global North rightly believes, how can you just give taxpayer monies to somebody else when they are not doing their own thing to sustain their environment? So my question is, we see massive expenses in military in the industrialization of the military, the amount of money spent, but there is no desire to spend money on achieving at least what all world leaders have agreed in 2015, the 17 SDGs. Thank you.
Mark, unmute.
Yeah, okay. You raised a number of points, and I would not presume to speak for any of the presenters. But I really like the story about the farmer in Helmand province who asks, "What's the price of my dignity?" You know, and I think that I'm thinking deeply about your question, and I believe one of the questions you're really asking is, you know, given what we see as sort of a stalemate at COP27 and a push by Global South to, quote, pay their fair share, are there any real chances for real evolution? Is that correct? Is that your real question?
Yeah.
I'm just asking to keep. I just want a clarification for my answer. That's why.
Yes, I think the question is more back driven by nationalistic agendas instead of agreeing on the global challenges that we have. And the common pushback from the South or the developing nations is that they don't have the means, they don't have the money. The global North got rich by extracting the resources from the South. Now they have an obligation to pay into. And so that's where the divergence. There is no agreement to, they agree that these are the goals we need to achieve, but there is no willingness to fund them.
So what I would say to you, I believe, right, that there is an analog in the 1920s that is very relevant today, and we have to consider the consequences of that analog when we assess global progress. And the analog is this. In the 1920s, actually, specifically in 1898, the U.S., through the Spanish-American War, acquired a colonial empire. It acquired the Philippines, Cuba, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. became literally overnight a colonial empire. And actually, over the next 60 years, it essentially rejected that role. It basically got rid of those colonies. And what happened, which I think is quite different, is that until the late 19th century in Europe, the problem of feeding a hungry consumer public was solved through colonies, because colonies had resources. They had materials that could be more cheaply acquired and then could be turned into products, right? And so, as someone once famously said, not me, but the US took a different route by accident. And the route it took was chemistry, not colonies. We figured out how to synthetically manufacture things like rubber, for example. We figured out how to synthetically produce things that before required a colonial system. And that leap conceptually, which was not evident at the time, but is evident in retrospect, if we are historians of science, that leap from colonies to chemistry, I believe we are going to make a similar leap in the next 10 years or so. The leap will be from basically empirical methods to quantum computational methods. There is a huge leap coming in how we solve problems. And that leap is the jump from the laboratory to the computational space. Because the problems that we're facing, for example, the problem of, let's say, like, a magnetic confinement in a fusion reactor, right? Or the problem of, like, hyper efficient battery production, or the problem of hyper efficient solar cells. These problems are so complex, they can't be solved even by today's supercomputers. And they're going to require, quote, a quantum leap into quantum computational spaces. And so I think that we're on the cusp of that revolution. We don't see it yet, but we're going to see that the jump from colonies to chemistry and then from chemistry as empirical method to computational methods will play a very significant role in how we actually evolve as a really sustainable systems. I mean, for example, like the best example is, the idea of battery-powered cars. Battery-powered cars don't solve any problems. They just don't. They don't. Battery production is an incredibly dirty production process. There's no way you can do it. You have to process about 250 tons of ore. You have to move 250 tons of earth to get 100 kilograms of battery. It's a horrible process. And in addition, you have to get electricity from somewhere, right? So I just think that we are on the cusp of a different kind of revolution that we will only be aware of in hindsight. That's maybe not the answer you were looking for, but I think it's a pragmatic answer when it comes to how COP is stalling. COP is stalling because government always has a lag of about 10 to 20 years behind industrial technology. So I think we'll see this effect in about 10 years or so.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, and really appreciate your participation and my colleagues at University of Perugia. And you will see us again sometime in March, right, Cecilia? Huh? Sometime in March, we'll have a second round.
Basilio, yes, we have to answer to the many question arises today.
Yes, definitely. Yeah. So keep your fingers crossed, and the announcement will come for our next round of this conversation in sometime in March. So thank you so much, my colleagues at University of Perugia and my colleagues at St. John's University here, College of Professionals, and all you wonderful fellows, doctoral students, my colleague Robert Romano there, and all those good people who have joined and made this 2 hours very, very interesting. And thanks again. Thanks, Gad, for joining us from Tel Aviv. Keep, I don't know where you are, but somewhere, always on the road, doing some good stuff to the world there through the work of and always good to see you all. So have a wonderful rest of the day. And I know in Perugia, it is Friday, it's time to go for a drink.
Thank you. We'll cheer to you and St. John's, okay?
Okay. Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you,
Goodbye.
Basilio.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Valentina. Thank you very much.
You.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very good. I enjoyed it very much.
Thanks, Almerinda.
Oh, Almerinda. Hi, Almerinda.
Ciao. Be well. Have a nice weekend.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Love to all.
Luca, good to see you, and Luca Pieroni. And
Hi.
So, Valentina, we'll get together again. So.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Nancy, for
Lorenzo.
comments in the chat. Thank you, Nancy.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Great job.
Bye.
Next time. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye. See you soon.
Bye-bye.